I'm Terry McCarthy. I'm the president of the Academy. I'm delighted to see you all here on a lovely Monday afternoon by the Wannsee in winter. This is going to be our last event of the year, 2018. So we're delighted you come for this. There will be many more events next year, but we finish off with a bang this year with Arthur Jafa, who's our Max Beckmann Distinguished Visitor. And some of you know, I think some of you here last year when we launched this program, it's named after the Leipzig-born artist Max Beckmann, and we start out with Kerry James Marshall, who was our inaugural Beckmann guest. And now we have Arthur Jafa today, and we will continue this in the coming years. Let me first mention some of our sponsors and supporters who helped to make this possible. Marie-Blanche Gebauer, Almut Gießen, Erika Hoffmann, Stefan Klein, Berhard von der Planitz, and Mary Ellen Schacki-Schutz. Thank you so much for making this possible. We're very grateful for that support. And I'd particularly like to mention Julia Stoschek and her team, Monica and Paula, who helped us to make this all work. And as you might know, Arthur Jafa just had his exhibition there, a series of utterly improbable yet extraordinary renditions, and that has just ended. So we're thanking so much to her as well. Our guest today, Arthur Jafa, is known to, I think, all of you in the room. Artist, filmmaker, and cinematographer, originally from Tupelo in Mississippi, and his work has been shown in Los Angeles, New York, Black Star Film Festivals, and all over. His artworks are currently held in the collections of a number of notable institutions, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Tate, Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, etc., and of course the Julia Stoschek Collection here in Germany. And he's worked with a whole series of very distinguished directors, producers, Julia Dash, Spike Lee, and I think you just made the music video to one of Jay-Z's most recent hits. Am I correct in that? Yes, that's what I'm told. So we're delighted you're here. He's going to give a talk first, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. But please give a very warm welcome to our Arthur Jafa, who came to talk today.
Well, thanks for coming out. I want to thank Julia and Monica and Paula and those guys. It's been really a wonderful opportunity to show work. And I was saying to Jason Moran, who was here last night, that most times you feel like if you're lucky, you're fortunate, and you can present your work to people. But I was saying we were saying it's a little like when they talk about people like Thelonious Monk or Charlie Parker, those instances where they had extended stays at clubs or something. Thelonious Monk was at the 5 spot at one point for like 5 or 6 months, and it's a completely different experience when you do a presentation and it happens maybe for a week or 2 or maybe a month if you're lucky. So it's been a really incredible experience. It certainly has it changed my life, I'm sure. And, it feels like that. So, okay. So, and of course, Gavin Brown. So, it's Gavin. So, okay. Now, and as far as lectures, I always start off with people say, "Hey, I want you to do a lecture." I'm like, "Oh, I don't do lectures. I just talk." There's an incredible, it seems to me like there's a lot of conversations with me out at this point. It's something that I've sort of spent a lot of time thinking about. I think conversations or talks is a big part of what I do, and to a large degree, it kind of defined what I did for a long time, because I would say, by and large, for the last 30 years, I mostly talked more than anything. Did more talking than making work, actually. Some of that, was, I think, structural things that are out of my control. But a lot of it was, just because of how it related to the whole idea of making work and whatnot. So talking, in a sense, stood in for work or things that I imagined doing but couldn't quite figure out how to go about doing. I have these books that, people might be familiar with. These are books of pictures, mostly pictures and collages and stuff, and I did those for about 15 years. I would say I stopped. I stopped right around the time my son was born, and my son is 14 years old now, so I haven't really been making them for a while. But the books also occupied a similar space to talking. They were stand-ins for actually making work or the things that I imagine. There's a term I like to use. It's called black pretension. And the pretension part is like a play on potential and tension. And it really kind of has to do with this whole idea that in as far as black being meaning like blackness or the life world of black people. And when I say black people, I'm primarily speaking of people of African descent in the Americas, as opposed to people of African descent in many other places, who oftentimes I think are not black, but are African, which is actually a perfectly fine and great thing to be. But, you know, our understanding and the way we've kind of come to understand it is like when African peoples were brought to the Americas, at some point there's a line that happened in which people didn't so much cease being Africans because they continued to be of African descent, but at some point on some kind of ontological level, they turned into black people or they became black people. And to a certain degree, a lot of the work that I'm preoccupied with is teasing out or parsing or interrogating what that is. Like, you mentioned that Kerry James Marshall was the inaugural speaker here. And the thing is, I've known Kerry since about '83, I think. I met Kerry in Los Angeles, where I was living at the time, because there was an interview with him in the newspaper, the Los Angeles Weekly, LA Weekly, which was an alternative paper there in Los Angeles. And I was saying to somebody last night, it's funny, like I came to know Kerry because the interview with him was so funny. It was just very, very funny, like the things that he said in it. It wasn't, in fact, his work, because you couldn't even really see the work. I mean, there's a vaguely black and white, fuzzy reproduction of one of his paintings, but you couldn't really make out the work. It was just the interview was so, it was startling in a way. I mean, I remember laughing out loud. And so what it was that drew me to Kerry in the beginning was his mind, the way his mind was working. And the thing about it was, I think I very much identified with it. So I spent 2 or 3 days just trying to track him down. And I remember calling a mentor of mine, Ben Caldwell, who lived in Los Angeles, and say, Ben, you know this guy, Kerry Marshall? He said, oh yeah, I know Kerry. He just got out of school. I think I got his number. So he gave me his number, and I called Kerry like cold, as we say. I just called him on the phone. Hey, you don't know me? My name's AJ. I read your interview. Shit, it was incredible. It was really funny. And we talked for about 2 hours on the phone. This is just like a cold call of a stranger, okay? We talked for about 2 hours. He finally said, yo, man, I got to get off this phone and get some work done. Why don't you come by my studio this weekend? And I said, okay, cool, great. And I think that was maybe like a Monday or a Tuesday. So that Sunday I showed up at 11 o'clock, and Kerry, you know, I've said like, and we talked for 8 straight hours. And Kerry laughs and say, well, we actually talked for 2 hours in the door. Then we had 8 straight hours in the actual studio. So, you know, I think back on my relationship with Kerry, but I think like one of the things that Kerry and I both shared that's sort of related to what I was talking about before is this, in a sense, assertion or commitment to the idea that we could be black, struggle to render or create embodiments of blackness, and that wasn't a split between universality. Because we felt like what we were oftentimes being positioned to do is like, in order to reach larger audiences, or to seem to be universal, we had to in some way diminish the specificity who we were as black people. Kerry, in his work as a painter, of course, you know, I've told people that his paintings are more things than they are painters, meaning they're complex artifacts that enter into these very complicated, complex sort of rhetorical dialogues with the history of painting. They are paintings, but more than anything, they're these things that engage the history of painting in complicated ways. And his sort of commitment to centering a black figure is a big part of what he's doing. I mean, in some ways, it's a very simple gesture, but it's a very complicated thing. Now, myself, I would say primarily as a person who sort of was thinking about film, but also thinking about the history of just picture making, period. And I say picture making as opposed to painting or as opposed to photography, is because fundamentally the question becomes, when you try to render the world in some kind of way, what kinds of protocols or methodologies, these kinds of things, what kinds of things are in place in the apparatus that frame what it is that you're seeing? And so Carrie and I have had a very, very long back and forth around this whole question of like, fundamentally, why should we have to be any less black in order for people to be able to see our images or to, in fact, identify with them? And we kind of figured at a certain point that it was very clear to us that the problem lay not in us. Like, in other words, if, I used to say sometime by example, if you take a Greco-Roman sculpture and it's a male figure pointing at the stars, pointing at the sky, everybody can understand that as a kind of emblem of man's ambitions or, capacities, what man dreams about. But if you paint that same figure black, all of a sudden it gets narrowed down. The same exact figure pointing like this can no longer stand in for man's ambitions. All of a sudden it becomes at best black man's ambitions, or if you put breasts on that figure, all of a sudden it has to be women's ambitions. You can't have a female figure point at the stars and represent humankind in its totality. And so we felt like we really kind of wanted to resist that in every way. And at the same time, we want to do what every artist, I would presume, wants to do, which is just make cool, or as I would say, dope things. Make things that are kind of interesting, to look at and think about. So by and large, I mean, the process itself has been, it's been an adventure. It's been complicated at times. It's been a lot of fun. It's at times been, it's come with a lot of melancholy at times. I was giving a talk a few days ago in Zurich, and Glenn Ligon, who is a friend, an associate, a person I've also known for quite a long time, had posted recently on his Instagram feed that he was at the Basquiat show at Louis Vuitton in Paris. And he was just saying, he said, I think it was a very short phrase, he just said like, masterpiece after masterpiece. He said, it's just incredible to see this amount of incredible work. He said, it's exhilarating, but at the same time, it's very depressing. Because, of course, as everybody knows, Basquiat was barely 27 years old when he died. A talent like that really comes along once in a century, honestly. And so it's hard to even imagine what he could have produced, what would have been possible. I mean, of course, there's a whole romance, if you burn twice as, burn twice as bright, you burn twice as fast and all that kind of junk. But by and large, you think he wasn't even 30 years old, so I'm like 5 or 6 days older than he is. We're so approximately the same age, so I'm constantly confronted with the idea of like, what would he have done at 30? What would he have done at 40? What would he have done at 50? We can't even imagine what he was capable of. So at the end of the day, it's a loss to everybody. And it's not to say that, I did stand up in one talk to this board of regents and said, you guys killed Basquiat. So it's, it's not like some individual person killed him, but there's a certain, I was talking to a friend today, a really good friend today, and I was saying that there's a kind of weight that that you feel as a black person in these contexts. And they were like, well, what? And I said, well, it's almost like barometric pressure. It's like you come into a room, like before there's a thunderstorm, the way the atmosphere feels different. It's kind of like you come into a space and you have this stuff swirling around you. And I mean, that would be bad enough. That would be something to just take account of if that's all it was. But oftentimes, or mostly what accompanies it, is the pressure that's placed on you to pretend like that isn't in fact there. Like there is no barometric pressure, that you're not feeling it, that it's not affecting you, that you should note it. If you note it, then people get uncomfortable. They become uncomfortable with you. You become uncomfortable in the context. I mean, around 99 and 2000, I sort of had my first little sort of foray in the art world per se, and had a little success kind of immediately, but realized very quickly I had a taste for it, but I didn't have the stomach for it. I realized, and I had known Jean-Michel since, not very closely, but, in passing, had known him since the early 80s, of course, and just I mean, it just amazed me just to think of, like, here I am at the time, I was just about almost 40, and I was like, wow, I can't really take this. I can't take entering these rooms and not just being the only black person, but also being expected to, not expected to, it's not like nobody was saying this to me, but having to function in a space where the difference that I felt, the sense of otherness that I felt, the burden of, in some ways, having to process it was on me. And I just said, I can't do this. And I just kind of walked away from it, you know. And now here I am, some 15 years later, I guess, 15, 16 years later, and I've had this success, I guess, if you want to. It is successful, I mean, I guess. I'm very ambivalent about it, but not ambivalent about the success, so to speak, but ambivalent about my own capacity to manage it, the burden to, and sometimes to articulate it or try to speak on it. Sometimes I think other people don't necessarily feel obligated to do so, or they run from it, and I don't know. I feel like I'm trying not to evade it. I'm trying to take it on and, in a sense, factor it into the work that I'm making. So, by and large, that's pretty much what I have to say. You know, I start to wonder, like, am I making things in that remove people's ability to basically have some critical distance about what it is that they're seeing? Is it too solicitous? Is it too easy? Is it going down too easy? So that has put me, you know, I've gone down this path now of trying to be much more, I guess, in a sense, selective about when I do and I don't sing, in a sense. I like to think of, like, you know, you got Aretha Franklin on one hand, and then you got Bob Dylan. I mean, nobody's listening to Bob Dylan because his voice is beautiful. You know, that's just not why you listen to Bob Dylan. I mean, you listen to it because of the quote-unquote content of what he's saying. And then there's someone else like a James Brown, like, who seems like he only has about 5 words in his whole, you know. You don't judge James Brown by the criteria which you would judge your Bob Dylan. He's doing something completely different. And then I would say there's an Aretha Franklin. And I like to think of Aretha Franklin as some person who's, in a way, situated between the two of them, in the sense that, on one hand, she's handling sound as an elemental force, but at the same time, she actually has lyrical content, too, in the way we would typically say lyrical content. So, but the question to me is, like, when do you shift into a Dylan-esque mode where it's really about the thing that you're singing, but you're not making beautiful sounds, per se, to go along with it? And when is it all right or efficacious to make beautiful sounds? And so I guess for me, like, I'm kind of at the point now where I'm really trying to figure out what it is I want to do and to what end, I guess. Like, I definitely don't want to be the guy who's chastising people, because that's boring. It's boring to me, at least. It's boring to me. So with something like Love is a Message, at a certain point, people will come to me, black people even, would come to me, and they would frame it as a kind of Black Lives Matter thing. Like, it's like I'm making this thing, this sort of demonstration of all the horrific shit that's happened to black people. Which is, you know, yeah, a lot of horrific shit happens to black people. But I don't know, like I was telling a good friend again, I was saying, like, the kind of catastrophic violence, the precarity of black life that people speak about now is really not what most people experience. Most people don't experience catastrophic violence. They don't experience a police coming up and shooting you in the head or something like this. But what happens is, if that happens to one person that you know, it does traumatize everybody. What most people experience is what they call microaggression, or these tiny little bits of aggression. The thing about it, though, it's like a tsunami of microaggression, you know? So it's a drop, but it's like a trillion drops, and you experience them day in, day out from the point that you're born. So I guess, again, I'm kind of resistant on one level to something like Love is a Message. I've said to people, why don't people ever talk about Bernini in relationship to Love is a Message? I mean, an artist I'm really obsessed with, actually. And I think I could go through something like Love is a Message and show you how the twerking bodies and all that kind of stuff is really much bound up in what's happening with those figures. And I even think it's something like the White Album. To me, like like when Reginald Dennis, who was the truck driver who was being beaten during the LA riot thing, like when he's crawling, there's something about how he's crawling that also reminds me, and this is not to hate on one hand to be saying like, oh, this is just as legitimate as a Michelangelo or something like that, but when the guy's crawling on the ground, he's doing the same kinds of things that those figures do. And that if you look at the history of Western painting, you have these, religious paintings and stuff. Those things are political in their time, in their moment. We don't see them as political now necessarily. So those things always are coexistent. They're not mutually exclusive. And so I know for myself, I'm trying to make work that's neither evading the situation in which I find myself, evading the responsibility, and I wouldn't even call them the burden, but the responsibility of speaking out for Black people, if you want to say. I would say not just Black people, but speaking out for anybody who's like an other, who's not whatever the sort of normative idea of a citizen would look like. But at the same time, also just want to make beautiful things. So I think I'll just maybe end on that.
And I want to get at this idea of, so if you're a white artist today, you mostly want to make things that would engage viewers.
Yeah.
Hopefully sell some.
We would presume.
Right?
Yeah.
They probably don't have that same tension that you've talked about. You start out with this notion of black potention, that you have both a desire as an artist to make nice stuff, beautiful stuff, whatever, but also to speak to a certain political issue that is uppermost on your mind.
I had to resist that a little bit because it's not uppermost on my mind. It's really not.
Okay.
I mean, a little bit, maybe that's just because I'm a libertine. I don't know. But it's really not what's uppermost in my mind, but it is something that...
But it's there.
That immerses me.
Right.
It's like I'm in it.
And you feel you have a responsibility to speak to that.
I'm not trying to be difficult.
I'm just quoting you, what you just said.
No, I know.
Yeah.
I'm saying. I'm not trying to be difficult. I feel yes. I don't feel I have a responsibility. It's I feel an ethical imperative to engage the idea of whether I have a responsibility.
Okay. So then you approach this video project you just showed, and that's just the beginning of a longer work, you think?
Yeah. Well, it already is. It's 30 minutes now. It's probably going to be a little bit longer. I just showed you the beginning.
We saw whatever.
8 minutes.
8 minutes. You start out with this is sort of the cognitive dissonance between the lyrics of some of the song, Love, and so on, and then these guys walking around with swords and that beast, whatever that was, pretty scary beast.
Yeah. I think it's a hyena. It's supposed to be a hyena.
Yeah, it looks something fierce that I would not like to meet in the dark. And
so that's how black people feel.
Right.
Yeah.
You set that up, that tension.
Yeah.
And then you go to the riots and Reginald Dennis and the beating.
Right.
What's the thought process there, if I may ask?
The thought
process of that, that's how you sequence that.
How I came to put it together or what it's supposed to mean?
Yeah.
Pretty intuitive, actually, truth be told. I like to feel, W. Du Bois says there's this thing called double consciousness that's part and parcel of blackness. It means to have multiple subject positions going on in your head, and it's a consequence of the sense of otherness. When black people were brought to the Americas, we were told we weren't human beings. And so, by and large, for several hundred years, all the things that verify you as a human being in the world, citizenship, communality, access to possibility, all these kinds of things were denied black people. So our insistence and ability to retain the sense of our humanity in the context of that was very internal. It was I like to say sometimes that black people created culture in free fall. So for me, it's like whatever that, a lot of times when I'm putting things together, I feel like I'm popping in. I don't even think it was just a double consciousness. I think there's, sometimes I say trouble consciousness, meaning, or triple, quadruple consciousness going on at the same time. So sometimes it's just gut stuff. Sometimes I'm being critical about what I'm looking at. Sometimes I turn the critical thing off and just try to. I mean, I find by and large the best things that I do, or the things that strikes me as the most interesting things, are things that I'm not aware of at all when I'm doing it. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, pulling the Dylan Roof footage at the particular moment where it landed and having the lyrics say what it did, that wasn't intentional at all. I just had the Dylan Roof footage, and as I was putting things together, I put it there. And when I put it there, I was like, I was like, oh shit, that's kind of intense. You know what I mean? But it wasn't like I'm making an intense thing and then it's like I achieved it. It's like, this is kind of really spooky and weird. Or like, for example, one of the things that the piece is trying to do is set up this, if not tension, at least dichotomy between, I asked friends of mine who are white if they would pose for me. And it's just really weird to say, hey, I'm taking pictures of my white friends. Would you pose for me? It's just very weird, like rhetorically. Even I was like, and I started making jokes about it. I was like, I'm taking pictures of all the good white people that I know. It's like really bizarre proposition. And I think mostly my friends would just say, okay, we trust you. But I was like, white people are not used to being objectified like this. They don't really know how to process it. But I think the piece is really trying to oscillate between, like Cornel West has this thing that he says, like, there's certain things you cannot not know as a black person in America. Mm-hmm. He doesn't really name them, but he just says, but I think one of the big things that you cannot not know is whiteness. Mm-hmm. And I say whiteness, and I make, in the same way that Fred Moten says, black people have a privileged relationship to blackness, but we don't own it. We don't have a proprietary relationship to it. You make the distinction between blackness and black people in the same way I would make the distinction between whiteness and white people. Mm-hmm. And so the piece is kind of oscillating back and forth between these things that I know about whiteness, these demonic aspects of whiteness, which I cannot but not know, even though white people make a lot of cool shit. You know what I mean? Like, for real. I mean, I like Iggy Pop. I like the Stooges, There's a lot of really dope shit, But the piece is really trying to oscillate back and forth between what I cannot not know about whiteness and the specificity of white people who I know and love, right? And who also have, they've given themselves over. They're trusting me. They've given themselves over to being in a piece where I know a lot of people would flinch away from the whole idea that they were in some way being brought into proximity or associated perhaps in some ways with, like I said, the more, horrific aspects of whiteness. So in the piece, like, a lot of times I'm doing things intuitively, like, say, for example, when you see that very fierce-looking guy with the beard in the beginning, who looks like, definitely looks like he could be a fucking Unabomber or something, like, for real. But he's a hairdresser. Like, he's like a very famous hairdresser, And so on one hand, I'm like, it's a demonstration of love on his part for him to allow me to use his image in that kind of way. But then things happen really funny. Like, I laugh, like, when the guy is singing and saying, I'm tangling these strings. The guy said, these strings I'm tangling. Well, he's a hairdresser. So if you know he's a hairdresser, it's actually a very funny kind of thing. Not many people are going to pick up. But I can't say without laughing, I know, hopefully when he says it, he'll laugh. But, so yeah.
And then you have this white guy who's talking about white fear.
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't know if he's a trucker or not, but he's filmed.
I know. What's so funny about that? Everybody said, like, is he in the truck? Is he this? It's because we have all these tropes about...
It's also the angle, I think, where he's being filmed.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, yeah, I agree with you. It's like, but there are these tropes we have about white Southerners, rednecks, like there's probably going to be a Confederate flag behind his head or something. It could be true or not true. I don't really know. I don't know very much about him.
But did you find him, or that's just footage you got?
I found him on the YouTube. I need to find out who he is, but I have no idea who he is. I was just startled when I saw it. And as I'm apt to do, I just threw it in the file because I thought it was startling, because you very seldom hear a white person speak in such harsh and unflinching terms about whiteness. It's not something. I mean, if he was black, you would be saying it was Malcolm X or something, but he's not. So,
who else has questions? Please.
I had a question about, you mentioned micro... Thank you. You mentioned microaggression toward the end of your talk, and something that struck me when I saw the exhibition, I don't remember if it was attributed to you or to someone else, but the notion of the camera lens as being inherently white.
Yeah, that's me.
And given the way that you select images from social media, and that we live in an era when we're inundated by these images that could be seen as microaggressions, I wonder if that's changed in terms of working in the late 90s and early 2000s versus working today for you.
Changed. I'm just trying to change in what respect, from what to what?
If your understanding of the visuality, the visual aggressiveness or aggressivity of certain kinds of images has changed, because the image that you showed, the footage from LA, that's pre-internet footage. So that would only be seen at the time on your local news.
Right.
But now we have access to, we could watch that and we could all dial it up on our phones right now and see that very aggressive image. Right. So I wonder if that has been a factor at all in your practice.
No, completely. Yeah. I mean, it's funny, when you said it, I was trying to think, do I think of these images as instances of the microaggression or aggression that I was talking about? I guess I don't. I had to think about that a little bit more. But in as far as this footage and stuff, right, like Love Is a Message in particular, it sort of came about because all of a sudden everybody was like videotaping things with their phones, The LA riot is clearly a turning point where all of a sudden you started to see footage of malevolence, by cops and stuff, that was documenting things that black people have been saying for hundreds of years, not just like recently. For hundreds of years, we were saying like, we've been mistreated. We've been treated like this. There are accounts of it, accountings of it, but there are no images. When the whole Abu Ghraib thing happened in the U.S., and there was those images of the American soldiers basically torturing I think they were Iraqi prisoners, but prisoners, they were essentially tormenting them and torturing them. That was a big uproar. I was teaching at the Bard MFA program at the time, and one of my colleagues did a really incredible breakdown of the iconography. Had all this image from the Spanish Inquisition, because there's one image where a guy has this sort of poncho, and he's standing on this block with this peaked hat. And so he did an incredible breakdown of the iconography and the precedents for these images and stuff, because they were making images. They weren't just like beating people or waterboarding people. They were actually posing people and taking images of them. So, he gave this presentation, and then he was saying what startled the American public so much is that people couldn't imagine these images, and I just chuckled. A lot of my friends, we just chuckled there because we were like, what do you mean we couldn't imagine these images? We don't have to imagine these images because we know them, And I said at some point, I said, look, if they had been if people had smartphones 300 years ago, if slaves had smartphones, it would be it would be bigger than the Louvre of documents of horrific shit. It's just that nobody could take a picture. The first time I heard somebody say they want to put cameras, I remember, they're putting cameras in phones. I was like, that is the dumbest idea I have ever heard. I just thought it was a really stupid idea, But, little did I know. But I say the LA riots is kind of interesting because that is that moment where you sort of felt what the future was going to look like. Even though, in fact, when Rodney King was beaten, somebody had a video camera in their car. That wasn't on their phone. But there's something about the structure of it that's so similar to what we see now, where everybody, it's like once it happened and people had a phone and they realized they could actually film these things that were happening, then it just became almost imperative to do so. And there's so many, it's not like you're fishing around for opportunity to do it. It's just happening all the time. So people start, and then I think right around the same time my son was born, that's like, for me, right around the time when YouTube and these things sort of came online and they start to be part of your kind of daily life, at least for me. And so I'm seeing it's just like a wave of things. Like Trayvon Martin in the States, kid was killed and stuff, but there's no video component to that. It's just that he was young, he was killed. In a sense, you have to go back to Emmett Till, was the first instance in which actual child was killed, but then there's some media to accompany what it actually looked like because his mom chose to do an open casket thing. And then so you saw his mangled body. And that was even just in the black media initially. It was in Jet Magazine and things like that. And then eventually, because it was there, it got taken up in the media at large. And so that whole history then of actually making available actual images of the kind of violence that black people are experiencing was part and parcel of these moments now. So all of a sudden, there's this tidal wave, to say tsunami, a tidal wave of footage. It seemed like every week there was another video popping up of somebody being abused by policemen. So to a certain degree, I just started throwing the things in the file. I wasn't even really, and somebody said, oh, your practice is by archive. But I kind of resist that a little bit because I don't know if the stuff that's I don't know if YouTube is an archive. In the classic sense, an archive is some footage that landed somewhere where nobody could see it. It really, the public didn't have access to it. It was put away, and maybe if you had some sort of institutional relationship, you can get permission to go and be in the archives, right? But that's not what this stuff is. This stuff is always available to the public all the time. It's sitting there. And everybody's saying, like you said, it's on your phone. Like people are saying, you got images of black people being killed in your video. I'm like, yeah, but this is stuff that's on everybody's phone. It's not like some hidden away. I went and found some footage of, Marilyn Monroe dead body or something like this. This is like shit that's everywhere. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. Yeah.
There's one there.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
So 2 days ago, I went to this event at the space that I work at Savi Contemporary, and it was this event that basically was for African and Black people only in Berlin, and the title was Tokenism and the Perils of Black Elitism. And being in that environment, I found it was very like machismo and very like, there was a lot of anger happening, but I was kind of confused because I feel like on one side there was this conversation about, it's not about whiteness, it's about money, and it's about reparations and about getting as much money as you can because there is still this massive wealth distribution issue in the world, and people don't actually want to be white, they just want to like not be starving and like
right.
Exactly right. But then on the other side, a lot of people were like, these are traders who are going into these communities, who are going into these white spaces, who are, like learning how to basically one-up the white man to get these things. And then once they get this thing, they leave their communities behind, and then they just go and live in the suburbs and like do whatever. And I come from, I guess, like a privileged background, being college educated, whatever. My parents are from Nigeria, but I just found it to be like a really, really uncomfortable like paradox to sit on. And I'm just kind of curious to hear more about like your experiences having to like navigate this world, and in this world in particular, and advice that you have for young artists who are kind of like wanting to make work that is like effectual and that is for everyone, but also like having to deal with like the other side of it, which is like the hard part is like getting the money and getting the support. And so, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I've had people come up to me and ask me, how did you do it? And I'm like, well, I'm not sure how I did it, but I know that you don't want to replicate how I did it. You don't want to get to your damn near 60 years old and finally be able to pay your rent. This is not the way to do it. You know what I mean? This is not. Therein lies madness. But I think in this discomfort that you're feeling, it's just like, yeah, it's uncomfortable. It's very, there's no way around that. It just is what it is. That's just the physics of the situation. So you just have to, live with it. This guy told me one time when I was in school, and this is both affirming what you're saying, but kind of countering it, or maybe another way to think about it. He was showing a film. He was from Angola, actually. I went to the Howard University in the States, and I got into a conversation with him, and I was telling him just how uncomfortable I was feeling. I was feeling not at ease. And I said, yeah, and sometimes my friends say when I'm looking at them, they feel like I'm just looking at them like they're bugs, which made me very uncomfortable because I kind of recognized what they were saying on one level. I was looking at them like they were bugs, but I said, but I'm really uncomfortable with this sense of alienation I'm feeling from my community or the people I love or I identify with. You know, I grew up, like I said, in Mississippi, so I had a very charged relationship with the context. Mississippi, outside of the Appalachians, is the poorest region in America. So I grew up in a very poor region, but then my parents were teachers. So I was already, there was a kind of tension there. I was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, but grew up in Clarksdale, Mississippi, meaning like Tupelo was the model post-integration southern city, and Clarksdale was not. Clarksdale was segregated, unrepentantly segregated, and segregated now. Even though by law it's not segregated, but in every other purpose it's still segregated. But I used to go back and forth between there on a weekly basis. So it was a 2-hour drive away. I'm not really sure exactly why my parents moved us from Tupelo to Clarksdale. They took up a teaching position at a small black college that was outside of Clarksdale. And I think they got caught up in, they had this pretty visionary president of this college. My parents, they were a certain generation, they got caught up in this whole idea of education. So they moved us down to Clarksdale. It's like taking your kids to, I don't know, whatever abject space you would say, with missionaries. It was kind of a missionary thing, I think, a little bit. Even though, in fact, they were black, we were black, and the context was black. So we ended up in Clarksdale, but every, like Friday after we finished school, like within an hour, we were on the road to Tupelo. So it made me very self-conscious in both environments because none of the environments got normalized for me. So when I was in Tupelo, I was very conscious of my cousins. I was like, they got a fantasy view of the world. This is not the world. It's not the real world. But when I went back to Clarksdale, I was like, you think this is the real world? That everything is segregated and split like this, you know? And it was the back and forth. So I always had this sense of alienation, let's say, a difference, standing out. At the same time, I had this longing to be oblivious to that and to just feel like I just belonged in whatever community, you know, around the people I grew up around. So I'm at Howard. This guy shows his film. We started talking. I say, look, I feel alienated. He said, you know what a griot is? And I said, yeah, I know what a griot is. People know what a griot is. A griot is basically an African oral historian, storyteller, but they tend to supposedly, they're the historians, but it's oral. They hold the tradition in their head. I said, yeah, I know what a griot is. He said, but do you know where griots come from? I mean, and I was like, yeah, Africa. He's like, no, do you know what engendered griot? I said, no, I don't know. He said, let me tell you how it goes. He said, it goes like this. There were two brothers who were on some long epic quest. And they went away from their community and they went out in the world. They had all these adventures and whatnot. And at some point, the cycle was finishing itself. You know, they were actually making their way back to the village that they grew up in, their natal context. They had incredible adventures. They learned things, grown, all this kind of stuff. But it had taken its toll. They were very weak, and they were going to barely make it home. And one of the brothers realized that he was so weak he wasn't going to make it home. He was just not. He didn't have enough strength to make it home. But he didn't want to endanger his brother. So he said to his brother, look, I just need to take a break here. You keep going. I'm going to take a little nap, and I'll catch up with you in a little bit. His brother said, okay, cool. I'll see you in a little bit. I'm going to keep going. And he basically laid down on the road to die. He was like, I'm just going to lay here and die. After a few minutes, the brother that had walked with said, it's taking him a long time to catch up with me. I'm going to go back and see if there's a problem. So he goes back. he sees his brother lying on the side of the road, and he realized immediately what's happened. His brother's dying, and rather than in jeopardy, jeopardize his ability to get back, he wanted to just take himself out of the equation. He realizes immediately, so what he does is he takes a knife and he cuts his own calf off, and he makes a fire and he cooks his own calf over this fire. And then he wakes his brother up and says, hey, look, I found some food, you should eat. So he gave the food to his brother ate it, regained his strength, they stood up, they limped back on home, they made it home. So they get home, and people are enthralled to see them. Everybody's cheering. But in that way, in the myth, they almost also immediately, they see the brother's leg is bleeding, and they understand immediately what's happened. The brother who had, quote unquote, eaten his own brother's flesh looks down, sees his brother's leg. He realizes what's happened. I've actually consumed my brother's flesh. So what he says is, okay, from this point onwards, me and my sons and their daughters are going to sing the praises of you and your sons and their daughters. And their sons and their daughters are going to sing the praises of their sons. He says, so this is where the first griot came from, the impulse to do praise songs, to sing songs about the history of the other person, right? He said, now the thing about it is griots have a very complicated relationship in traditional societies. He said, on one hand, they're honored because they retain the history of the community and stuff. But on the other hand, when they die, they don't even bury them with everybody else. They put their bodies in trees and let the maggots eat them, right? And he said the reason this happens is because griots feed on the flesh of the people. It's necessary. Somebody has to do it because somebody has to retain the history. But that function of feeding on the flesh of the people makes people feel wary around you. Even though you're doing your quote unquote your job, it makes people feel wary around you. So what he said to me was that he said you got a griot impulse in you. People are gonna always feel uncomfortable around you. Even the people who love you are gonna feel uncomfortable around you. Live with it. He said you just have to live with it, So to a certain degree, I would just say, in the same way, this discomfort that you're feeling around your positionality or your saying people are angry and this and that, you just got to live with it. You just have to live with it and just try to move towards, well, first of all, you're trying to understand the landscape because it's complicated and it's shifting all the time. But you just have to get right with the discomfort because it is going to be uncomfortable. It's like you're in the ocean, you're going to get wet. There's no way around that. You're going to get wet. Practice, if you need a butterfly stroke or a back stroke or whatever, practice what kind of strokes you use, but you're going to get wet. You gotta accept that. So I don't know if that's helpful. Sure.
So I've been to see your last exhibition twice. Really loved it. Went with my friends a couple of times. And throughout the whole experience, some bits I didn't understand so well. But after reading about your talk, and I kind of put things into a sort of perspective from how I understand it. So there was a second part where you showed a video of a choir, a lady singing a choir.
Oh, we should look at that. That's a good segue. I paid you for that. Okay.
Nothing but the blood.
Yeah.
This made me really emotional.
Yeah.
And I wonder how, I don't know if it's because I can relate to it directly. Growing up, there wasn't a lot of black people on TV. There wasn't a lot of black context and stuff like this. But the whole thing being centered around the way in which people perceive black people, from my understanding of what you were trying to portray, I wonder if non-black people see it in that sort of sense and get emotional throughout the whole process of seeing it in the same way I did. Because I also, I worked with my friend Aki and she felt the same way. There was a lady I met that was visiting Berlin from LA, and I said, hey, you got to check this out, and I went to meet her afterwards, and she was like, damn, like, wow. I was overwhelmed with emotion, and I don't know if it's that sense of relation that we had to this exhibition, and if that was your intention of the segregation you spoke about, not directly that you wanted to segregate people and people's emotions and feelings, but, from your perception, how do you feel that other people may have felt by it, and have you had any sort of feedback relating to that? because I felt really
Why
deep
don't you
about
show
it.
it now and then reprise the question? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
You're going
that
to show it
does
anyway,
make,
right?
yeah, that does make sense. But let me just respond just a little bit because
Okay.
I'm gonna lose it. That was a lot. I try not to have any intentions around how people respond to stuff. I just try to make the thing first of all. But I'm a student of once a thing is made, I try to pay attention to how people. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's something wrong with me, but it's a sad testament that I just didn't anticipate white people. My experience has been that white people wouldn't necessarily be so moved by some of this stuff. It's been interesting, just to see. It's complicated, I think, when you start going down the path of Elvis Presley was born in my hometown, in Tupelo. I say my hometown. He was born in my hometown. And people would often say to me when I was in school, Elvis wasn't creative at all. He just stole from black people. And I'd be like, no, Elvis was pretty damn creative. I mean, that's objectively true. He was creative. The issue, we have to be very careful on how we frame the issue. The issue is not that Elvis wasn't creative. The issue is that his creativity was valued all out of proportion with the creativity of people around him who, if not as equal, in more instances, more creative than he was, like a Little Richard, whose creativity wasn't valued. It was valued because it's impossible not to deal with Little Richard. On a certain level, it's just not possible. But the commensurate, like if Elvis got the amount of value, accumulated value for his creativity, then Little Richard should have been a billionaire, but relatively speaking. But because he was black and he was gay, a gay man, right? He didn't get the same, his creativity wasn't valued. So I was saying to people, look, let's not do to them what they do to us. Let's not diminish somebody else's creativity because we have a problem with the way this shit's set up. Let's be very specific about what we're saying. So I say this to say, in a way, the whole notion of I try not to be presumptive. Even though if somebody asked me, I would just say it's just how my heart is warped. It's how my experience of these things are warped, that if I showed a black people or black person suffering, that people just wouldn't feel it because they just don't feel black people. They don't feel. I mean, honestly, I don't want to get in trouble with any animal rights people, but if I step on a bug, I just stepped on a bug. I'm not really feeling it like I stepped on a person. I'm not feeling it like that. That's my own limitation. But I think by and large, this whole process in which people get dehumanized so that other people can relate to them in a non-human fashion without losing the sense of their own humanity is a lot of what's going on.
I don't know how you done it, but you managed to bring out emotions in myself and the people I went with. I guess this is a separate question, and thank you for showing this as well. But how do you manage to captivate that all? Where does it all come from that it comes in such a
I don't want to take credit for Landry Johnson, but
not that. But I mean the way it's all put together, it's built really nicely.
Selector. Seems like Selector. It's just it's just what you pick, and you try to pick things that like I said in the beginning, they have affective power already, but you try to put them in concordance with other things that have affective power. And there's a weird kind of quantum of physics. There's some kind of physics of it, like what thing right next to the other thing will actually intensify how you experience the thing that's in front of you, like how you perceive it with something else. This piece definitely was a certain response to Love is a Message, which was a piece where I like to say I atomized different things, like I reduced things, but then like I said, I started to feel like, I don't know, something about putting things together like that, it just seemed like it completely dissolved people's critical distance or something, which I came to be ambivalent about. I mean, And so this challenge with this was to take bigger chunks of things where you didn't atomize things. You actually let them still retain. You know, it's just like a DJ who will basically take a song apart and sequence it for one thing. Another verse is the old school kind of selector where you play the record. You know, you drop the needle, you play the record, and you pick the needle up, and then you play another record. It's the things still retain a little bit more of their autonomous thing as opposed to being absorbed into this bigger new formulation. So some of it's like that. And then, you know, there are a lot of things that I do to, I would say intensify it. It's kind of like with the Leandra Johnson, with everybody who's in there, really, it's like you pick things that have power. It's like, you know, I Have a Dream, like MLK. Okay, you can read that, and it's a very moving text. Most people think it's just about the text, though, but basically when you hear it, like MLK's voice quivers in a very particular kind of way. And it's the combination of the quivering in combination with the content is what gives it power. And the historical circumstances of the moment, and people invest in that moment with energy and all these kinds of things. But you can't really get the full effect of I Have a Dream as a speech if you don't deal with the musicality of it. So there's a lot of things that I've sort of slowly developed over years, which generally at this point sort of going into the regime, what termed black visual intonation. They're just like slurred and bent notes and things like that, but they're like the visual equivalent. So there's a lot of things that are happening with sync, like in Al Green, they function in a certain kind of way, like when he goes in and out of sync. There's micro slippages between him going in and out of sync in relationship to the audio or the text, you know. So it's like not slow motion, it's not fast motion, it's like a micro shifting back and forth between slow and fast motion, which is kind of what you're saying. So with Leandra Johnson, there's a lot of that going on. So it's things that you don't so much see, but you feel them, I think. So I don't know. So some of that, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for spending time with us. Wish you luck in the future. That was great.